are Australia's hardline immigration policies impacting border security? And how are they affecting the lives of refugees?
We'll hear more about the country's system of offshore prisons in today's show. Remember to send us your comments and questions live via Twitter or YouTube.
I'm Malika Bilal.
I'm Ahmed Shabuddin, and you're in the stream.
Zero chance of resettlement. That's the message the Australian government has been sending to asylum seekers desperate to migrate into the country by boat. It's been 5 years since Australia began refusing mainland resettlement for asylum seekers, sometimes described as boat people. For refugees who do take the chance, they face the prospect of indefinite detention while they wait for their asylum claims to be processed in offshore refugee camps. The government says its hardline stance against illegal immigration has deterred people smugglers and illegal boat arrivals, but at what cost?
Here to discuss this is Natasha Blucher, Detention Advocacy Manager with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. She's joining us via Skype from Melbourne. In London, Al Jazeera Sydney correspondent Andrew Thomas, who covers asylum seeker policies in Australia. And joining us on the phone is Abdul Aziz Adam. He's been living at Manus Island for nearly 5 years. He is an asylum seeker who received his refugee status 3 years ago. Welcome to you all. I should start by mentioning we did reach out to Australia's government to take part in this conversation, but they declined our requests.
And with that, I will start on my laptop with this quote from the government, from Peter Dutton, to be exact. This is Australian Minister for Home Affairs in an interview June 23rd. This is how he describes the policy thus far. We're in a danger phase because only a month ago, we stopped a steel-hulled vessel with 131 people coming out of Sri Lanka. There are 14,000 people still in Indonesia, and there is excited chatter among people smuggling syndicates about the prospect of Australia being available again. He goes on to say, it's essential that people realize that the hard-won success of the last few years could be undone overnight by a single act of compassion in bringing 20 people from Manus to Australia. Andrew, with those words, does the government see these past 5 years and this Never Australia policy as successful?
Malika, I couldn't catch the end of your question.
Has the government seen these past 5 years as being a success in terms of their immigration policy?
An absolutely huge success. Yeah, the government is very proud of its immigration policy over the last 5 years. In fact, this was brought in by the other party in Australia, the Labour Party, back in 2013 when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister. But then shortly after that, Kevin Rudd lost an election, and the Conservative right-of-centre government that came in, first under Tony Abbott, now under Malcolm Turnbull, has run with it, expanded it, and really owned it and made it their own. And they're very proud of it. And those comments you heard from Peter Dutton there, the Immigration Minister, are all about domestic politics because, like it or not, and the international picture is obviously looks at Australia and sees these very cruel, unnecessarily cruel in many people's eyes, policies, but domestically, these are vote-winning policies. Australians do not like the idea that their borders are out of control. That's been proved in opinion poll after opinion poll. And while there is a substantial minority of Australians who disagree with that position, the government thinks the voters that are going to keep them in power are the ones who don't like boats arriving. And they say that if Labour get back in, they'll soften the stance. So what you heard there was all about domestic politics.
And Andrew, hearing you say that raises a question that we put out to our audience, our community. We asked if, the system is actually deterring illegal immigration and if it's working. And interestingly enough, we got one comment from Joe Diddley here saying it's illegal to deter refugees and it is immoral regardless of whether it quote unquote works. What an appalling premise. Natasha, how do you see success as an immigration policy? Is this the right measure?
Firstly, I think that it's very interesting that the government starts talking about boats the moment it becomes domestically uncomfortable. As Andrew said, this is all about domestic politics, and the moment the Liberal government becomes uncomfortable in domestic politics, whether it be on another issue or there's something embarrassing that's occurred for them, then they'll start talking about boats again. So they conflict with themselves all the time. They'll constantly say, no boats have arrived, we've stopped the boats. And then they'll say, oh, watch out, there was another boat that arrived last month. So it doesn't really make much sense except for the fact that it's very evident that this government is playing political football with people's lives. So I think this comment that you've just brought up is very, very accurate in that even if it were successful, say for a moment that it was successful and that we called this kind of behaviour success, which we of course don't, but if we did, for argument's sake,
I want to show...
Is it okay to achieve any success at the expense of somebody's life?
Natasha, of course, valid question there, and one that our community members are pondering. Before we move on too much further, I want to show a map to our audience just so they get a perspective on what it is we're talking about here. Now, what you're seeing on your screens are Australia's offshore prisons for immigrants arriving by boat. Well, the Manus Island facility closed on October 31st, 2017, but many detainees still remain in transitional camps on the island. We got a comment actually from someone who's among those. This is Izzatullah, someone whose tweets we read in our very last show when we talked about the closing of the prison there on Manus Island. He says, "I really don't have hope for resettlement. I already rejected PNG, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. I won't. Those countries don't have respect for human beings. So I hope the US will give me an appointment asylum. I hope." That's just one hope of one person. But Aziz, you were there talking to us on the phone in Manus Island. Talk to us about what it is you're facing in your time there on Manus.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And briefly, I wanted to give you something about the current situation in Manus Island. And as you know, for all the talking and bluffing about the government or Peter Dutton personally, he's been making about the asylum seekers or refugees on Manus Island. 5 years ago, when we have been sent to this island, we were not informed that we are going to spend 5 years of our life on this detention center. And we were not informed that this is what will happen to us. We're going to lose 8 or 7 of our friends. And in fact, after they send us to this island, we have lost 7 of our friends, and which is they have been killed deliberately by the system in order to send a message for the other people around the world. And we have been used by this government in order to pass their agenda in a parliament.
When you say
the
killed,
situation right
Aziz,
now
I want to pause you there. When you say killed by the system, what do you mean?
What I mean by killed by the system is the people who have died on this island, they were sick and they had been neglected deliberately. Instead of giving them the proper Medicare, they did not provide the proper Medicare, and it ended up they took their life away. So that's why I call a system deliberate kill by the system.
You know, Andrew, as you're listening to that, I pulled up this headline here. Critics warn of a humanitarian crisis for 600 asylum seekers in an offshore Australian detention camp. This is 2017, when you were last on our show, and we were discussing refugees refusing to leave the Manus Island detention center. What's happened since then? Where are we now?
Well, I was last there in November. In fact, as the PNG, the Papua New Guinean police, went into that formal centre and forcibly removed the asylum seekers and refugees who didn't want to go. I've got to say, I think Aziz would say the same. I'm going to ask you in a moment, but that was as much about protest as it was about anything else. They realised that Manus Island was in the spotlight of media attention, like, frankly, it rarely is anymore, because the Australian media is bored of this story. They hardly touch it. But at that moment, as that camp, the formal prison-like facility on Manus Island was closed, and the refugees were being moved into more transit camps elsewhere on Manus Island, they knew that if they made a stand and refused to go, the media would cover it, and to some extent they did. So that was about getting attention, but it really was one of the few times that this story has broken through into the Australian media, because given that both sides of politics now in Australia adopt the same policy, they're all saying that those refugees on Manus Island and Nauru are never going to come to Australia. There isn't much political debate to follow. The ABC, the national broadcaster in Australia, is taxpayer funded. The government is continually warning the ABC that its funding is at risk, and many think, I wouldn't want to comment, but many think that the ABC pulls its punches to some extent. And then there's quite a big cohort of the media that is quite anti-refugee and pro-policy. So that was all about getting attention, and who can blame the refugees for it? What the government would say is that Yes, it is tough for those refugees on Manus Island and Nauru, but the bigger picture here is that people are no longer coming to Australian shores, putting their lives at risk. That's what I like to say. More than 1,000 people drowned. Their boat sank on the way to Australia in the few years before they brought in this policy. They don't want more of that. They don't want uncontrolled immigration by refugees. 50,000 people came in the few years before 2013. They don't want to see that start up again because they want to be seen in control of the borders and then sell to Australians more generally the idea that high immigration is a good thing.
Well, Natasha, I see you saying, yeah. You know, as Andrew was speaking, of course, we know that, you know, from 2013 to 2014, of course, the numbers plummeted from 20,000 to 160. But we have a lot of comments coming on the bigger picture, Andrew. You teed up, you know, that idea of what is the geopolitical aspect of some of this? Why is this even, you know, happening? Even with the neglectful media coverage, you know, we have this tweet. Let me, actually, it came in from Sarah Ruby Smith. She's the director of Project Humanity, a group that advocates for refugees. She said, Australia continues these human rights abuses, knowing that the aid money Australia supplies to countries like Papua New Guinea and Nauru will guarantee they can continue. Natasha, you know, Andrew's nodding. I know that there's more at play here, but what do you make of what Sarah says here? You know, that Australia deliberately picked vulnerable countries with vulnerable populations, and like true colonialist nation that they are, their government does whatever they see fit there.
That's 100% correct. So I have worked on Nauru and I've visited Manus, but I probably know the ins and outs of Nauru a lot better. And what I would say is that Australia is 100% in control of these centres. So the day-to-day operations, the movement of people, the provision of staff, every single aspect of these camps is administered by Australia, and yet they abscond their responsibility to Papua New Guinea and Nauru. And they do that because
it's important, Natasha, to make the point that the Australian government denies that they control Manus Island or Papua New Guinea, and they constantly tell people like you and people like me in the media, this is not a question for us, this is all now about Papua New Guinea's government, put questions to them. Of course, they never apply to you nor us, likewise Nauru. I'm with you. Australia's government in practice controls everything that happens in these places, but they deny responsibility and are able to because these are, on paper at least, sovereign countries.
That's right. And I mean, the other thing that I would go back to is something that Aziz said earlier. He commented that 7 people had died on Manus and that those 7 people's deaths were the responsibility of the Australian government. So I just want to add to that in total, 12 people have died under this policy. So 7 on Manus, 5 on Nauru, 12 in total. For a lot of those people, I've seen the medical records that have outlined their decline, outlined their mental health disintegration to the point where, you know, 2 people, in fact, have set themselves on fire. So that's self-immolated. A man threw himself out of a bus. A number of people have overdosed. A number of people have hung themselves. And you can see in the Australian government's own records their mental health deterioration in great detail. So we obtained the medical records that written about people by IHMS, International Health and Medical Services, which is the medical contractor that the Australian government pays to provide healthcare. And they are the ones who have not provided sufficient care or not responded sufficiently. Or in some instances, you can see where they've recommended again and again and again that a person receives a certain type of treatment. And the Australian government, so Australian Border Force, which is a government department, have declined that request for medical care. And as a result, the person has eventually died. So that line of responsibility is extremely clear.
And Natasha, as you mentioned, what you're describing is conditions in Nauru. I want to share with our audience a couple of pictures that Aziz sent us. Moving through on my computer here. Aziz, you've told us that these are the transition centers on Manus Island, and I'll move over to the next one here. Talk to us about what it is that we're seeing, these pictures that you sent of what looks like perhaps newly refurbished or newly built transition centers. What are the conditions like there?
Well, basically, these 2 or 3 transit center, they have been built back then. One of them, they have been built back then in 2015, and the other 2, they have been built recently when we have been forcibly removed out of the former detention center on Lambrome. And Also, let me just take you back and about what the Andrew point that he said about forcibly removed. We have been deprived, we have been denied medical access, food, and water for 24 days. And they want us to come outside here in Papua New Guinea, and they want us to resettle in Papua New Guinea. And we have mentioned to the authorities so clear that we prefer to stay inside, and we will look after ourselves, and we no longer need your services. 24 days, we felt we had a feeling of freedoms, and we knew ourselves that this is the thing that it missed from us for the last 4 years. We haven't had any access even to take one single step without asking their permission or without escorting by one of their security guards. And we have been humiliated, we have been abused, and we have been disrespected, where to the point that they want to force us to lose our dignity.
You know,
and what happened right now is Australia is abusing innocent people, and they are not respecting the international law, and which is human right. To them, it's just a word. And Australia, they are in control of Manus Island. I'm one of the men who has spent 5 years on Manus Island, and I did much of my research, and I find out that Manus Island is being controlled by the Australians.
Aziz,
and as we see.
Forgive me for interrupting you. I just wanted to stop people, stop you right there for a sec, because I want to bring in some other voices to this conversation. People who are echoing this idea of who really is controlling the situation. You're saying Australia is controlled based on your experience. Again, Sarah Ruby-Smith pointing out that the Australian government has been very clear. For example, when New Zealand wanted to deal directly with Papua New Guinea to take some refugees from Manus, Peter Dutton again suggested this would jeopardize Papua New Guinea's relations with Australia. So, that's maybe an indication that they are very much in control. But I wanted to also put this towards you from Roshika on Twitter saying, the question isn't about what we had asked, which is, are there human rights violations happening? But how is Australia getting away with it for the last 5 years? What are the UN international human rights mechanisms to solve this, or other governments saying to Australia, based on your experience there for now almost 5 years, what would your answer be, Aziz, to Roshika? How are they getting away with this?
Well, I don't think they're going to get away with it. But as we can see in a front picture, that the Australian government, they are really more capable to get away with it, because no one will judge Australia. As long as Australia is one of the American allies, no one's going to judge them. For the last 5 years, I have met more than 10 different organizations, humanitarian organizations. On top of that organization is UNHCR. They have visited us for more than 10 times. And every single time they come to the island, we tell them the story. And we keep reporting every single incident that's happening here. But as a matter of fact, we don't see any movement from the international community. And in fact, like we know, Australia is a big country, but at the end of the day, the law has to apply to each and every country on the world, not just only the third world country like Africa or the Middle East. No one is above the law. But in fact, let me take you back. On 2001, Australia detained people on Manus Island for 6.5 years. For 6.5 years. And at the end of the day, they just shut the compound down, and they took those people back to Australia. But no one even raised the words. The words went on the media, but the international community did not involve.
Right.
And all we've been hearing is this is a national security matter.
Right. And Aziz, I hear you there. I can see Andrew trying to get in there. Andrew, what did you want to add?
Well, it's very unfortunate, as ever, that the Australian government doesn't come on a programme like this, because what you don't get then is the other side of the coin. So I'm going to play that role for a moment. Not that I agree with it, but because I want those arguments to be, rebuffed if necessary by Natasha and Aziz. But what they would say is that, first of all, these aren't prisons. These people on Manus, like Aziz and in Nauru, are free to walk around Manus Island. They're free to walk around Nauru. That's true. I've been to Manus Island. People can walk around freely, albeit you're on an island and it's a very remote island, so you can't get off there. That's point one. Second is, and they can leave as well. In theory, they can go back to the countries they came from. I mean, is that a practical thing for somebody who's fleeing persecution? Well, again, that's one for the Australian government. And they would also say that they are resettling refugees. They've got this deal with the United States. Almost 300 refugees have now been resettled in the US, and the number, therefore, on Nauru and Manus is dwindling. What they'd also say, though, is that we're making the wrong comparison here. We shouldn't be comparing facilities and what happens for refugees in Australia. And about 20,000 refugees get resettled in Australia every year through the United Nations scheme. Australia says it's very generous there. We shouldn't be comparing the refugees on Manus and Nauru with them. We should be comparing them with those who didn't have the money or the means to get on boats and come to Australia. Why should the queue jumpers, as the Australian government would call them, be treated differently from a refugee stuck in a Lebanese refugee camp or in Sudan, for example?
Right. Natasha?
So, as I said, I want to politely interrupt you, Andrew, and I want to ask Aziz a question, because I think that this will paint the picture of something that he said earlier about the loss of dignity and the loss of humanity in these centres. Aziz, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Aziz, over the last 5 years, Aziz, how many times do you think service providers and people in the detention camps or transit centres have referred to you by name, and how many times do you think they've referred to you by your number?
Well, in fact, I'm glad that at least I can hear now people call my names, but I've been known to the system or to this government or to the service provider on Manus Island is as a number, not a name. And not only me, but 100 men or 200 men in every detention center, they just refer them as a numbers. And on top of those people, I can say my name is on the top, but they never call my name. I had several arguments with the security guard, like, why you don't call my name? And they say, look, we have been introduced to you by the authority that you are only a numbers. You are not a name.
Well, you know, it's always easier to, I mean, dehumanization, I don't want to bring up that argument. But actually, if I can, with the time we have, Andrew, I want to quickly go back to something you referred to in terms of referring to these things as prison camps or detention centers. We have H.D. Flores saying, I have two responses to a question we had put out on social media. One, I find your use of the word prison to be interesting. It implies criminalization and predetermined lengths of time to serve a sentence. He questions Australia's policymakers if they also view them as criminals within a prison system. Of course, Andrew, appreciate you bringing the other side. What do you think they would say? How much does terminology factor in terms of, you know, keeping the Australian public in support of this policy?
Well, it does matter. They absolutely reject the word prison. I did a long interview about a year ago now with Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Immigration Minister, and he got quite angry when I kept using the word prison, but I kept saying to him, well, in effect, that's what these islands are. And he put the points I put earlier, that they are free to go back to their countries, that they can walk around the islands. They are not prisons. And they also make this important distinction in their eyes between refugees who have been through the process, confirmed to be fleeing persecution by the Australian and Papua New Guinean or Nauruan governments, and asylum seekers who have claimed asylum but have had their claims turned down. And quite a lot of those still on Manus Island and Nauru fall into that second category. And the biggest question of all, frankly, is what is going to happen to them. The United States deal that I mentioned earlier as well, that is resettling nearly 300 men, women and children. Now, it may yet resettle some more, but it's not resettling Iranian refugees nor Somali refugees, who make up big numbers on those two places because, of course, those two countries come under Donald Trump's Muslim travel ban, so-called. So, again, there's a big question there as to what will happen for those people.
Right, and I will add one more thing they would say, and have said this, being the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. In June 22nd interview, here in Australia, we have one of the most generous refugee and humanitarian programs in the world. The reason we can do that is because we decide, the Australian government, representing the Australian people, who comes to Australia, not people smugglers. Our thanks to our guests. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Natasha Blucher. Thank you to Andrew Thomas and Abdulaziz Adam. I will give the final word, though, to Larry Forbes, who wrote to us on Facebook saying, for the past 22 years, successive Australian governments have worked hard to groom their electorates to make them fear and hate asylum seekers. Their justification is supposedly that such cruelty will keep Australia's borders safe. He doesn't think that's the way to go about it.